morning again, everybody. Great to kind of see you. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 24 this morning. Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24. I remember when I was praying about coming to Lee Heights. I was serving in a church in Cherokee, which is that way, I think. Yeah, that direction. About 45 minutes to an hour that way. And I really felt like it was time for me to seek the next step in my ministry. And so I was praying about it. And around April or May of 2017, I met the pastor of this church at an event. And I introduced myself, and it was just a normal conversation. And in that conversation, he mentioned that his church was looking for a youth minister. And I said, okay, awesome. Let's exchange phone numbers and let's talk about it. Around June or July, I sat with the search team, and they thought that I did well enough to come and meet the students. And that's when the chaos began. My first Wednesday here, before I even got voted in, I came to meet the students, and I delivered a message. Can't even remember what the message was about. I'm not worried about it because the teenagers don't even know what I talked about on Wednesday. So they sure enough don't remember what I talked about 5 years ago. And if you've ever met me, at times, I am very awkward. All right, easy now over here on this side. I am very awkward. I'm okay up here on stage. I'm not nervous at all. But you sit me in a circle and ask me my name, I'm like, I don't know. I mispronounce my own name sometimes. James, not even the hard one. And so I was like that awkward with the students. And so I'm like, well, that didn't go well. They might vote no. And so a few weeks go by, I get a phone call, and they say, hey, the church has voted unanimously for you to come and become the youth minister here. And I was ecstatic. I was so excited. I came in, and it has been great ever since. We've had our ups and downs, but it's been great. Well, a couple of years in, I'm having a conversation with a couple of the students, and my whole first meeting them came up. Come to find out, there were actually some people who did not want me to be here. And we honored some of them today. So there's this whole conspiracy about whether their votes counted or not, but I'm here, and I think for the most part they would vote yes. But through conversations with them, the common thing was one of two things. We love Brian. If you ever met Brian, you know everybody loves Brian. And then the second thing, which kind of goes with what we're talking about today, is they did not like change. They did not like change. They knew Brian and Gina. They knew what that was. And I was something different. And so for these students, much like 5 years ago, me coming in was a change, their lives are changing. And for you who are parents and family members, your lives are changing. These kids that you changed their dirty, nasty diaper, you heard them cry whenever they didn't know how to communicate what they were feeling, and then as teenagers, you wish that they would stop trying to explain how they're feeling sometimes to you. Throughout all of this, your life is changing. And change is hard. Change is scary. And so the same thing is going on in Joshua 24. After the death of Moses, a new leader of Israel came, and his name was Joshua. And Joshua led them out of the wilderness into the promised land. Joshua led this nation to many, many victories over nations that they should have lost to. Joshua was a great leader. But here we are in Joshua chapter 24. Joshua is getting to the end of his life, and he wants to leave the nation of Israel with one more message. a message that, hey, things are going to change. And so a little bit more context for you. The nation of Israel, man, sometimes they just did not get it. Most of the time, they did not get it. And so in the Old Testament, you see this cycle, and our students know about this cycle that I'm talking about. We see that God blesses, so God blessed them by allowing them to go into the promised land. And then man sins. The nation of Israel began to worship other gods. They continued to worship the gods of Egypt. So God blesses, man sins, and then God punishes. And we see that consistently in the Old Testament, that God punishes the nation of Israel, but ultimately God redeems. And then God blesses, and then man sins, and then God punishes, and then God redeems. And it's this cycle over and over and over again. And so Joshua is warning them about this cycle. He's saying, this is not the way that it's supposed to be. So if you will, read with me Joshua chapter 24, starting in verse 1. It says, Joshua chapter 24, verse 1, it says, Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem and summoned Israel's elders, leaders, judges, and officers, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the region beyond the Euphrates River, led him through the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave the hill country of Seir to Esau as a possession. Jacob and his sons, however, went down to Egypt. I sent Moses and Aaron, and I defeated Egypt by what I did within it. And afterward, I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt and you reached the Red Sea, the Egyptians pursued your ancestors with chariots and horsemen as far as the sea. Your ancestors cried out to the Lord, so he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and brought the sea over them, engulfing them. Your own eyes saw what I did to Egypt. After that, you lived in the wilderness for a long time. Later, I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived beyond the Jordan. They fought against you, but I handed them over to you. You possessed their land, and I annihilated them before you. Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. He sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you, but I would not listen to Balaam. Instead, he repeatedly blessed you, and I rescued you from him. You then crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. Jericho's citizens, as well as the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites, fought against you, but I handed them over to you. I sent hornets, or horror, ahead of you, and they drove out the two Amorite kings before you. It was not by your sword or bow. I gave you a land you did not labor for, and cities you did not build. Though you live in them, you are eating from vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Verse 14 says, therefore fear the Lord and worship him in sincerity and truth. Get rid of the gods of your ancestors. Get rid of the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and worship the Lord. But if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today, which will you worship? The gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you so much for the opportunity to study your word this morning. God, I pray that we do have our focus and our eyes on you. And God, I pray as we step into this next stage of our lives, for our students, for our student ministry, for our parents, for our families, God, I pray that we continue to trust you. Because, God, we know that no matter how our circumstances change, you are the same. So God, I pray that we find our joy and our hope and our peace and our salvation in you. God, we love you and we praise you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. So Joshua wanted them to do three things I found in this passage. The first thing is Joshua wanted them to remember their past blessings. Their past blessings. If you remember, most of what I read was Joshua reminding them of all the great things that God had done for them. He reminded them, he said that God had blessed Israel with multitude of nations and people through Abraham and Isaac. He reminded them that God delivered them from Egypt. He reminded them that God allowed them to defeat the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. He reminded them that God gave them the promised land. And so for us, as we head into this next step in our journey, and we look forward to the journey ahead, it's important for us to remember the past blessings that God has given us. For you as a parent, as I said during the ceremony, you may have prayed for a very, very long time for your kid. For some of you, you may not have meant to have your kid. But you look at the past 17 or 18 years of your kid's life, and there are so many blessings. Man, whenever they were able to hold themselves up on the couch, when they were able to crawl, whenever they were able to walk, whenever they said their first words, whenever they began to drive. For many of you, whenever they gave their life to the Lord, you can reflect on all the good things that God has done in your life and in your kids' lives. And for those of us who don't have graduates today, the same thing is true. That whenever we face the journey ahead of us, it's important that we remember all the great things that God has done in the past. It's important that we remember all the great things that God has done in the past. And so for me, as I reflect on my past 5-6 years with these students, I think of a lot of things, but here are a few. I think of going to a concert with Tanner and Kaylin. I'm not going to make it through this. I'm going to try, though. I think about going over to Renee's house a few months ago after Cruz gave his life to the Lord. I think about playing basketball with Alex, Tristan, and Walker so late that their parents are calling me, wondering where they are. I think about when Carson was 13 and he would throw something right in front of me, and then he would say that he didn't. And then I would do everything that I could to hold that in and not to laugh. I think about whenever life got hard, getting a big hug from Darby. I think about being awful at painting the conference room over there. That's my fault. And Kylie's. I think about being stressed at camp and Macy coming up, putting her hands on my shoulder and telling me to breathe. I think about a 14-year-old Kaylin who was insistent on going to McDonald's, but I was trying to prove that I was more stubborn than she was. And we have yet to go to McDonald's. I think about all the times that Jackson did his goofy laugh, and me just making that my one goal of the week, to make Jackson laugh. And also I think about getting to know Brock over the past few months as I saw him from afar on Jackson's social media. So Brock, it's nice to meet you. And so it's very easy for us during times of tribulation and trials and times of change to forget all the great things that God has done for us. It's easy for us to forget that. And so often what you see in the Old Testament, once God does something big in the lives of the Israelites, God tells them to build a monument to remember what God had done. Whenever they cross over into the promised land, they literally built a pillar of rocks so that for generations and generations, whenever Israel passed by those rocks and the kids said, "Why are those rocks there?" they could remember the blessing that God had given them. And so in the next few weeks, your students will be graduating, and you'll be taking pictures in their caps and gowns. I want you to use that as a reminder for the rest of your life of the blessings that God has given you. That God has blessed your students with graduating high school, which is a big deal. Which is a big deal. And man, I'm jealous of them that for many of them, they're done with school at 18. As someone who's spent most of my life in school, you are lucky to be done. And so it's important for us to remember the past blessings that we've had. As we look forward to the journey ahead of us, it's important that we remember past blessings. And so Israel was a lot like us. They would often forget all of the great things that God had done for them. And when we forget all the great things that God has done for us, we run back to our sin. We run back to the things that tempt us. And the nation of Israel did the same thing. And so Joshua wanted them to remember past blessings, but he wanted them to also understand the present challenge. The present challenge. Despite all of the great things that God had done for the nation of Israel, there were still some there who worshiped other gods. Parents, you have prayed over your students. You have cried over your students. You have had long, sleepless nights over your students, wondering, what in the world are they doing? You know all the times that you've spent on your knees just praying for them. And they are in this place today, where for some of them, the only thing they know about God is what they've been made to know. For some of them, they've not known Jesus for themselves. For some of us, in a room this size, for some of us, we have heard about God. We grew up in the South. We know about Jesus, but we don't know Jesus. And yet, there's still some of us who do know Jesus. And all of this, what I'm about to say applies to all of us. Whenever life got hard for Israel, they ran back to their old sin. They ran back to the thing that they thought would bring them joy, peace, and hope. They ran back to it. And so that is a present challenge for you students. You will be tempted in the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years with many great people, great things. You will be promised that this thing will bring you joy. That person will bring you joy. They will bring you hope. They will bring you peace. But the truth is that we can only find our joy, our peace, and our hope in God. And so the present challenge for us is that life is changing. That for some of us, we're going to move off, and we're not going to be made to go to church anymore. And we have to decide for ourselves what we're going to do. And so Joshua wanted them to remember past blessings. He wanted them to understand the present challenge. And then finally, he wanted them to know about the future opportunity. Because the thing is, in this moment, in this story, for the rest of Joshua's life, and for the rest of the leader of Israel's at that time lives, the nation of Israel was good. They were following God. And for many of you, from the time that you were born to the time that you were 18, your church has ministry designed specifically for you. They have children's programs. Parker is leading children's church right now. They have youth camp. They have programs designated for you. But now, once you graduate, things change. You no longer have youth group. And for some of you, your parents are no longer going to make you go to church. And so your future opportunity is this decision that you have to make. What are you going to do? Are you going to follow God, or are you going to follow the world? And this was a decision that Israel had to make. If you look at verse 31 with me real quick. It says that Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works that the Lord had done for Israel. So while the nation of Israel was under the leadership of these people, they followed God. But the thing is that things changed. Joshua died. All these leaders died. In only a couple pages in Judges chapter 2, we see that the nation of Israel had gone back to their idols. Judges chapter 2, verse 2. It says, "You are not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You are to tear down their altars." Right? So God's saying, you're not to make a covenant, you're to tear down their altars. And he says, "But you have not obeyed me. What have you done?" So you remember I told you at the beginning that the nation of Israel had this cycle where God would bless them, but then they would fall away. We're at a stage where the nation of Israel is falling away from God because Joshua and all those leaders had died. For the nation of Israel, whenever their circumstances allowed them to, or whenever their circumstances made it easy for them to follow God, they did. But when their circumstances made it hard to follow God, they didn't. And so our opportunity going forward is to choose what we're going to do. Are we going to follow? Are we going to follow God, or are we going to follow sin? Are we going to follow our temptation? And so, back in Joshua, chapter 24, you don't have to turn there. In verse 15, this is what Joshua says. And this is my challenge to you this morning. Joshua says in verse 15, "But if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today which you will worship. The God your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. As for me and my family, I will serve the Lord." And so students, families, parents, everyone here, this is the question that we have this morning. Are we going to continue to find our joy and our hope and our peace in the things of this world, in our sin, in things that are good but were never created to fulfill us? Or are we going to find our joy, our hope, and our peace in God? Only one of them will sustain us. Only one of them will lead to eternal life, and that is through Jesus. So, what are you going to do? As for me, and I hope that you've seen this over the past 5.5, 6 years, as for me, I'm going to follow Jesus. And I pray that you make that same decision today. So this time we're going to have a time of invitation. I invite you to stand up this morning, and that is the invitation this morning. What are you going to do? Are you going to keep depending on the world, or are you going to depend on Jesus? So this altar is open. We're not going to have a super long invitation, but unless we need to, and I'm all for that. And so this altar is open, and I want to encourage you to come. And even if it has nothing to do with what was said this morning, this altar is open for you.